Hello, Natroners, and welcome back to another episode of VFX with Natron. So, today's a weird day, because I had something totally different planned for today. But today we're going to be talking about bilateral blur. It wasn't my original. My original thing was I was going to do this thing involving the cloud. We were going to take the cloud node that we built last week and do something cool with it. But unfortunately, in the midst of doing some work on it, I got caught up in some other work, had to pillage. Well, I mean, I had to do real work. Anyway, so the problem is that I ran out of time to do something more, and bilateral happens to be one of those interesting nodes that I wanted to start talking about it at some point. I usually hold off on these discussion ones until Mondays, but it's for theory. But today we're going to look at it because the bilateral blur is interesting. It's not just one, by the way. There's more than one type of bilateral blur node. There's actually like 4 of them, I think. 4. Well, anyway, I don't have anything to say that today's goals are going to be this or that, because I was doing a bunch of experiments, and honestly, to truly do any good experiments, you got to, in fact, here, let's go over and take a look at something. Let's pop over to Natron. Alright, so here we are on Natron. This doesn't look impressive, because this is the empty thing. This is where we're going to be exploring. But over here, I was doing these interesting tests. Now, the tests here, this is a render test. What I was doing here, and I think this is a bilateral blur. This is a bilateral blur, a 10-frame loop of this text spinning around. All right, and what we have here is we have two things here. We have this is a bilateral GL, and over here we have a transform node. And this transform node over 10 frames, we can see I'll have it set up so that it loops over 10 frames. I want to know exactly how long does Natron take to render this sequence. So this, if you haven't used render statistics before, it's a good way of evaluating, is something better one way than another. That way you can determine, if these are good tests to do when you are trying to determine if you, for example, want to use a full-fledged motion blur over using something other than motion blur to get something. The question is the question of equivalency, and is it good enough, or is it worth it to spend the extra time rendering? And this is just a little bitty test, and admittedly I'm going to tell you this is not the most elaborate, because there's a lot of factors. How long your graph actually takes to update or update the image behind it can have a heck of a lot more of an impact on the overall performance of something like this. So what we got here, all right, what I'm going to do, I just want to bring this up because we're going to look at a result of it before we go into how it was built and so forth. And I don't think it's actually turning out for this particular situation to be as useful, but there are a lot of things bilateral blur can be useful for. I was hoping this was going to be one that it might be a worthy trade-off. We'll see. Let's evaluate this. All right. So, as I said, one of the things we want to do is, first thing is down here on my render, I want to make sure that I'm just doing a single loop. I want this to go one time. I don't want this to over process. I want to go back to frame 1. So I want I want to be on frame 1 here, which I am, by the way. This doesn't always update, but that's okay. It has now. We want to reset this. All right. and we reset our render settings so everything is 0. That way nothing is processing at this point. Nothing is processing. No, nothing up me sleeve. Alright, now when I clear my cache, it's going to render the first frame, and as soon as it's done rendering the first frame, it will log that into the time spent rendering. Alright, so I'm going to hit clear my cache. I'm going to clear all my caches. Now we can see it's rendering here. And it's going to do a render, and it's going to add in, and it's going to calculate out all the frame, all the nodes that are in this node graph, and figure out how much this first frame is going to take. And it took 12.75 seconds to render this one frame. Now you might say that sounds like a lot of time, but it may not be in the grand scheme of things. Remember, a lot of this bilateral does not add a heck of a lot to the overall render time. The question is the detail we're going to get out of this going to be worth the difference? And so we're going to render this out. So I hit play here, and what it's going to do is it's going to play one time all the way up to 10, and it's going to calculate out exactly how long it's going to take to render. And this is going to give me and this is only for the view as it currently stands. So we can see it just did its second frame, and it's at 27 seconds. This is going to take about 2 minutes probably to render. 1.5 to 2 minutes, I'm guessing. Maybe a little longer, 3 minutes. Anyway, you've got me talking about this. We can always shoot Natron for being slow. That sounds fun to me. Let's shoot Natron. Or we hate it when Natron takes forever to do something, right? Alright, I know. It's a pain in the butt. Plus, it's very satisfying shooting stuff. I like shooting things. Alright, now. While this is rendering, I'm going to put this off to the side and actually talk about what we can see here. This is bilateral blurred, and bilateral blur works off of this concept of it's shape based. It uses there's all kinds of ways that you can do bilateral blurring, and believe it or not, bilateral blur is used in so many things, and people don't even realize it. In fact, it is used in cameras. A lot of cameras, most of the cell phone cameras, like if you have an iPhone, or this one, little iPhone, or even your Samsungs, or your, Google Pixels, or what have you, they all use, or almost all use bilateral blur when they do their noise reduction for the color pass. It is an incredibly quick way of evaluating things, and I'll talk about that when we talk about noise reduction. But what it does is it looks, instead of and Blender even has it. It's in one of the with Blender, one of the early things that people used to do to get rid of the fireflies was that they would use a bilateral blur. They would blur things, but what Blender would do is they would do what was called pass renders, where they would render out everything. I think we got one more frame to do. It says we got one more. Oh yes, there we go. All right, it just finished its last frame. All right, so just going to hold that, and we're going to continue this in a minute and look. So that took 2 minutes 22 seconds to render that way. All right, to get this, to get what we've got here. All right, and we're going to look at this and evaluate it, and just see. And I'm going to switch this over so now that it's got a loop, so we can watch it play back. And what I'm looking at is I'm going to look at the edges of of this animation, and I'm just deciding, is it reading as a motion blur without with as few artifacts? Do the artifacts bother me, or do they not? And we're getting a little bit of slowdown due to probably doing this live stream, because it wasn't doing that before. But we're getting a solid 22, 21 frames a second, which isn't horrible, but it isn't great. We're not getting real-time playback. Anyhow, in my opinion, we can see there's a few artifacts in it. It does not look bad. It looks like that's a very acceptable motion blur. The question is that any better than what it would be if we take off the bilateral setup? Let's get out of this. So we can see here's our bilateral, whole bilateral aspect of it. And I'm going to go back to the first frame for a second so we can see. And you know what? I'm going to zoom in a little bit. We can see here some of what's going on with the bilateral blur and what some of the artifacts here. So what bilateral blur is doing in this situation is we have this threshold that if the value exceeds a certain tolerance, or I should say, if something exceeds a certain tolerance, it blurs it. If it's, or I should say, if it's below this tolerance, it blurs it. If it goes above this blur tolerance, then it creates basically an edge, or it doesn't blur it. And that's actually what's happening here. It's kind of like a blur. We can see in here this is all getting blurred in here, and that's because almost everything in here is falling under the thresholds. I've created certain little put a node setup here to help fine-tune what the nodes are, or what we're bilateral blurring. And the problem is that when we get to it works really well for isolating the individual letters, but we can see when we get over here, we start seeing this pixelization, and that's because the difference between the colors here and the shape of the letters as they're spinning are not they're different enough that these exceed the threshold and so are not getting added into the blur. If I change this value right here and increased it, this standard deviation, that's the deviation value. And if I set it up to a nice, if we were to reset it to its original, let's reset it to default, you can see this just blurred out because it exceeded the value. And so now this is no better than just using a regular blur node. And this is very good. But it involves, to understand bilateral blur, we have to, and this is a tolerance-based bilateral blur. In Blender, I'll mention that Blender uses a bilateral blur system, but it was you had to actually use what was called shape-based bilateral blur, where you actually have to define your shape. You use a pre-made mask, so to speak, of your shape, and then you bilateral blur inside of that shape. It basically blurs the things inside of it, and and it doesn't worry about having this tolerance. But the problem is that means you actually have to be able to dictate your shapes in some ways. And there are ways you can do this. It's very easy. We can actually do that using, chroma key, for example, or Rodos, or something like that. In fact, there is a bilateral blur. If we type in bilateral here, we can see we have five. I was wrong, those, I think. Yep. 5 bilateral blurs, and this. Oh wait. Also, take it back. We have 4 bilateral blurs built in. There is one in here that belongs to hit film, which is Ignite. That's what this bottom one is. That's not. Oh, I'll just tell you right now, that one stinks. You don't even want to bother with it. But anyway, the bilateral GL is really, really, really good. It's one of my favorite ones. It's actually probably, of the bilateral blurs, it's probably my favorite because it's really very fast. It's incredibly good. It just lacks a couple of the features that some of the other ones do. So this one here, though, this smooth bilateral guided, what guided means is that you're guiding it. You're putting in guides into it. At least you'll put a mask or something, and it will use the shapes as a guide. But the thing is that it works off of, these are all different. The bilateral GL, smooth bilateral, and the gimmick bilateral all work off of similar kinds of concepts. Anyway, I'm not gonna. We're gonna. I'll be talking about that in another way in the future. So the question here is, from the standpoint of what we're doing here, why does this matter? Why would we want to do this? Well, we had a render time of what was it? Oh, did I? It was like 2 minutes and 15 seconds, and I didn't write it down. I should put 2. I think it was 15. I'm just going to put 215. It's close enough. All right. So if we disable this, let's disable this section and just look at what we had before the bilateral blur. All right. Let me put the bilateral back to what it was. Hopefully this will. Yeah, there we go. All right. So I'm going to just. So this is what we had. You can see this is before and this is after, and you can see that the edge of this stays almost identical. It's almost exactly the same shape. So from a standpoint of motion blur, this is a lot smoother motion blur than this is. We have a lot of pixelization here. The big problem that we face here is, of course, there's pixelization over here, and we do get rid of some of it, but we don't get rid of all of it. And the big question is which way is that time that the extra time we spent? So we said it's 2 minutes 15 seconds for that. All right, let's see what it renders like without that. Let's maximize this. Let's fit it, and then we're going to hit Control 1 because that's exactly where I was. I'm here, and I'm going to rewind it. I'm going to pull my render back over. This is updated a few times since then. It's cleared. It's all good. We should be able to reset this. If we reset this and then we clear our cache, let's go and render our first frame. There we go. It took 6.5 seconds. So this is obviously going to take about half the time to render it this way. Probably. That's using a motion blur of 1. All right, that is a motion blur of 1 is what we had there. And the big question that's going to come out is 1 good enough? Is 1 with the bilateral better, or is it better to try and find a higher value of motion blur without using bilateral, like say 2, going to produce a similar result or a better result in the same amount of time? And these are the big questions. You never want to do these things. I'm doing this live here because, well, we want to know. These are the types of tests you want to do so that when you go onto a job, you can maximize your time, get the best result in the shortest amount of time. So here we go. We've got that done. That is unfortunate. I forgot to turn off this here, which means that we've looped and we've spent 3 minutes, and unfortunately now I've got to redo it because I didn't catch the time. All right, let's clear our cache. So let's clear all our caches. Let's let this refresh, and then we'll hit play again. And it should take about 1.5 minutes. So right, there we go. It's done. It's done the first frame, 6.8 seconds. It's probably not even gonna. It's probably gonna take about just over a minute 8 seconds, about minute 16, something like that. But compared to 2 minutes and 15 seconds, that's a lot faster. But the question is it acceptable? Again, that's the thing. Honestly, it's not a horrible motion blur. I don't like the pixelization on the edges, but it had some of that with the last one. The question is it going to read? By the way, this is rotating over 10 frames, 360 frames, or 360 degrees, which means we have a uniform thing. So the pattern is actually going to be visible consistently at the same point. We can just look at a spot, and if we stare at the same spot, we're going to see the pattern show up over and over and over again. All right, we're almost done with this render. Come on. Actually, it took 1 minute 42 sec or 1.42 seconds. It says, looks like it's finished, but I don't know. Well, if it updates one more time, oh, there it is. 1 minute 1.42 seconds. All right, so let's flip this on and take a look-see at this in looping, and just look. So yeah, there's definitely more artifacts. I don't know if people are seeing this, but I can see way more pixels on the edge here, plus on the sides of a lot of the letters, not on the N per se, but on this A and the O over here, we see. Definitely I'm seeing the beginning a lot of jaggedy little pixely things, but in the grand scheme of things, if I'm not super duper focused on it, it's not horrible, and there's ways we could potentially improve it. But it took it only a minute, and it basically took it half the time. Actually, it took it about a minute less. So the question was that worth it? Does this produce an acceptable enough result? That's a personal preference. To me, sometimes if I have a finicky client, or if it's an important job and time is of the essence, I might want to. The question is that minute? That was a minute and a half for 10 frames. If I'm doing a 30-second commercial, or that 10 frames we're not even talking a second here. So you're talking about, that's an additional 2 minutes for about 2.5 minutes per for a just 1 second's worth of animation. That could be a pretty heavy duty hit on the render time. That might not be worth it. All right, I think I'd have to evaluate it anyway. So over here, what I want to do is I want to compare it to this last thing, which is this bilateral, or this transform over here has a motion blur of 2. And let's go back to the beginning, and let's turn off the loop here, and let's maximize this. And so we want to bring this back. We're going to wait for it to finish redrawing. Oh, make sure we're at the same thing. Control. I want to hit F here, and then I want to hit Control 1 here, just to ensure that I have it. All right, so there we go. We're letting it render. Oh, and I want to get rid of this. This should be transform. Hopefully, I want to put underscore 2. There we go. All right. So we're gonna hit No, it hasn't finished rendering this. I'm beginning to suspect that 2, which produces 2 is producing a there we go. All right, so let's reset this, and then we're going to clear the cache, clear all caches. So as we can see, 2 took significantly. This is double the density of that motion blur. And the question is, so we had a 2:15 and we had a minute 1. I think it was 1 minute 1 second 1 point. I think it was 4-5 seconds or something like that. So, and that was 2 minutes 15 seconds, and this is saying it took 12.28 seconds for this to render that first frame. That's interesting. So that's actually very similar. So the question is, if I hit play now, oops, I didn't hit play, I'll hit fast forward. Crud, I've got to reset it. Bugger. Hold on, clear all caches. Ugh. No, we got it all made a boo-boo. There we go. All right, reset this. Cache, clear all caches. There we go. Now it'll render. And then I gotta hit play. Sorry. I know this isn't the most exciting thing in the world, but it's important. So why is this bilateral blur? We're going to do this one last test, and as soon as this test renders, I'll pull up the bilateral blur a little bit more, and we'll just look at what it does and how it works, and some of the things. And we'll talk about it. I'm going to talk about it probably Monday a little bit. Depends. I might hold off. I want to show. I have an animation I want to do. I've been working on the cloud plugin, and I want to do some more generator plugins for you guys. I really like the look of 2. I think I don't think the motion blur is worth it compared to the time. It takes about the same amount of time using 2 as it does using the bilateral system. So the answer for this particular use of bilateral blur. And as I say, I was rushing it. I was trying to come up with a topic today, and I think this isn't the best use of bilateral blur, unfortunately. At least not in this particular situation. There will be times when if it's a lower contrast, slightly lower contrast situation, you could potentially. Actually, it comes down to how you create your blur too. There's other ways of doing it. I'm sorry. So, if anybody's watching, I don't even think not one person signed up today for this, as far as I knew. Which means there's such an interest in this. Next week we'll get into bilateral blur. I want to talk about bilateral blur from the standpoint of noise reduction, and using it for noise reduction, because it's really, really, really good for noise reduction. But it can work very well for motion blur and doing some motion blur stuff. And anyway, this says it's almost done. Yeah, no, this took almost 2 minutes to do. Well, actually, yeah, that's faster. Actually, it did. It took just under 2 minutes. So this was produced in the same amount of time, or slightly less time, than the bilateral blurred version of 1. So, and I would argue that this has a much better look to me. So in this particular circumstance, I would say do not use bilateral blur for this, because everything I did, or at least not the way I have it set up. So what I had done here, I want to just go over why I did some of what's going on here, just so you guys can understand a little bit of it better. Because it's important. What's going on here is actually very important. And let's get this up to a nice 200%. And I'm going to re-enable the bilateral blur. All right, and we'll pull that off, and we'll go back here. So out of this, we have this. Now, to be fair, if I cached this, the bilateral blur, no, it's not gonna. All right. So here's our result. All right. So what would happen? What the bilateral blur is going to do? You know what? I'm going to cache this because I just want a single frame of this, so that we don't constantly. I'm going to just cache this. I'm going to set it to a manual frame, 1 frame. We want 1 frame, and we want to. Then we want to do a frame hold. Frame. Oops. Cancel. Tab. Frame. Hold. Thought I hit tab, but apparently I didn't. We're going to say first frame is 1. And we're going to frame hold that. And we're going to do it from the disk cache, which hopefully will take it a second. And then we should be good to go. As soon as this transform node finishes caching it, which it's doing right now. Some of you know. Huh. Well, this isn't what... Ah, there we go. Finally. All right, so it's cached it. All right, so now no matter what we do here. So, I'm going to... All right, so we're going to go from our this. We're going to go over here to our log. So why did I log it? As I said, bilateral blur works off of this concept of... here, let me disable these. And it might make more sense. So... let's, if we go here, we're looking at it prior to the bilateral blur. If I put on the bilateral blur straight on this with nothing else attached, let's pull that bilateral blur back here so we can see it right here. I can see my bilateral blur, and I have the spatial subdivisions. So what this is, the spatial subdivision, this right here, this is the... how much it's going to blur it. This can be thought of as the blur amount, all right? And it defaults to 10, all right, for the bilateral GL. And the value subdivision is the threshold at which it has to pass in order for it to be blurred. So if this is really low, like 0.1, but technically right now the bilateral blur is doing nothing to this. There's nothing happening at all. But as I increase this slowly, we can start seeing stuff is starting to happen. We're starting to see a little bit of a fuzziness that's going on. And what this fuzziness is this is the blur. The blur is leaking out of what's happening here, what's happened here. And I'm going to actually zoom into 400%. I hope that does not cause my cache to redraw. I don't know if that made my cache up. For some reason, we're not redrawing. Uh-oh, there we go. All right, so there we go. So here's our image up at 400%, and we can see as I scrub through these, all right, well, I can see that it starts to blur it, but it's not blurring it the same way that a blur node does. It's retaining here, these pixels here, these edges here, exceed this value threshold, and so what's happening is these are not, we're not getting blur down here, but when we get closer to the edge up here, these pixels, some of these pixels are starting to fall inside or below this value threshold, and so they're starting to blur. And so what's happening is we wind up with a hard edge that slowly disappears or turns soft, and so we get this sort of bleed into something that is blurred. All right, and as we increase this, slowly we will add more and more blurriness to this until there will become a point where everything starts to get blurred with it. Okay, and pretty much everything at this point is blurred. We can see that though everything, I mean, this is we can see things are exceeding the thresholds very significantly right up in here. And so, but it's not working like a regular blur. There's still thresholds that are being broken right in here. This looks very hard-edged, whereas it gets very soft right up in here. And then it's very soft around the outside of it, which makes it look like it's glowing a little bit. And that's all has to do with the fact that of these two values. And if we bring the standard deviation down a bit, what we're doing is we're reducing the blur amount, and as we do, we can start seeing artifacts start to show up. This basically can be thought of as every pixel in that blur. How far away from it is it blurring it? So if I reduce this amount down to say 2 or 3, right here at 4, we're still seeing a pretty solid blur around the edge here, but we're getting a haloing around the edge as well. Which is not good, because that means we're winding up with we wind up with something that's pretty good blur-wise. We're also winding up with a bit of a haloing or a halation, we could call it, around the edge. Halation is usually in video. Halation is this when the sun comes through. If you have or bright light, I should say, but it happens a lot with it. If you're looking at a window, okay, and you get the window in silhouette, and the sun comes through the window, a lot of times when the sun passes or the light passes by it, there will be this bleed of light, this glow that kind of rims it, and it's usually in the color of whatever the light source is. So if it's an orangey yellow, you wind up with over the black of the frame, you'll wind up with a halation that's this kind of orangey. It's very, in my opinion, it's a pretty thing. Some people could consider it an artifact, but it's a natural artifact. Of lens, or it's a lens artifact, but it's a video artifact or film artifact actually. Anyway, it happens, and we don't usually see it, and so you could use this sort of to simulate that kind of halation, for example. But anyway, the whole point was that we can reduce this down, and we can get the point. The whole goal is, of course, to get it to a point where you have you've reduced it enough so that there's not very much in the way of. Actually, this is looking pretty good right here. I actually like this better than I liked what I had originally. Oh well, that's what happens. And this looks like it may render. Well, I don't know. I don't want to guess. So you can see that it's all about playing with these numbers until you wind up with something of value where there's the threshold is small enough so that you don't get too much halation, and the blur is big enough so that things blend together. So you don't, when you get close to the edges, like here, it looks like it's a natural blend. And this actually looks, in my opinion, right here, I would argue this right here probably looks better than the chew. And the question that would happen in my mind at this point, let's see something here. If we go, let's see, we want to go fit. We want to go 0, 1. All right, there we go. So this is what it looks like with the 2, and this, let's just see something here. I want to see, I'm just curious. Let's put let's connect that back up to, I'm going to bypass, oops, I didn't want to do that. I want to get it off the shuffle. It's important that the shuffle's not included in this, because that the shuffle is there, because the shuffle is doing some transformers. All right, let's see. We are doing a comparison. We're going to just keep this small at this moment, because I want to. We're still doing it at a 1-to-1, but I want to bypass that disk cache so that I have an even comparison. Let's see. All right, so it's 1. We're going to reset this value. We're just going to do this 1 frame. Let's clear all the caches. Let's see how long this one takes to redraw this. It might take the same amount. All right, it took 6.05 seconds for that version of it. All right, and then we'll connect it up to the other, which is going to take a little while. Oops, no, that's wrong. I did something wrong there. Forgot to include my bilateral. But you know what? I'm going to just bypass all that so that we can. These were ways of controlling that threshold value outside of the controls that the bilateral node has itself. You can do that by controlling the contrast, so to speak, or the gamma, or using multiply. You can reduce the contrast level, so to speak. And using gain, you can control a different way of controlling contrast. The two different ways of dealing with contrast in different situations. All right, so this is almost done. This is taking a lot longer, it feels like, but all right, so we're going to reset this, and then we're going to go cache, clear all caches, because that looks, in my opinion, prettier the way it is. But the question is, does it take longer to render? Wait a minute, did I win? I'm not gonna. Yeah, I'm skipping the dish cache. That took 11 seconds according to that, so it is longer. But it is better, in my opinion. Boy. Anyway. I know. Boring day. Boring theory. Theory's boring to a lot of people, but it has practical purposes. And we'll be talking about this from as I say, we'll be talking about this from a standpoint of adjusting. We're going to be doing more with. Right, we're going to be using this in noise reduction in the not too distant future. Now, when we get into that, I think you guys are going to be very surprised at how good Natron is at noise reduction. Natron is probably, of all the open source programs out there, is the single best, with the potential exception of FFmpeg. Is probably the best, that to my knowledge is the best open source denoiser out there, basically because it has not only these for noise reduction, but it has other forms of noise reduction as well. So anyway, I know, boring day, boring. I'm boring. All right. Anyway, right. Thanks for watching. I know it was an exciting day. Catch you next time. Till then, keep on Natroning.